2014, China started carrying out its plan to attack 5 countries at once. It started building islands, military islands, right here in the South China Sea, inside the borders of other countries. These fake islands had ports, air bases, and anti-aircraft guns, all ready in case of a war. In just 2 years, China has made not 1, not 2, but 7 of these islands in other countries' borders without their permission. This is one of the reasons why US Army experts believe that these islands, right here in the South China Sea, have the highest chance of instigating World War III. And it all starts with the CCP and their unwillingness to respect other countries' borders. So, in this video, let's go over why the South China Sea is so important to the world and why China is willing to start World War III just to control these parts of the sea. I am once again asking you guys to like the video. My recent videos have been getting restricted heavily in the algorithm, and considering this topic is war-related, I doubt YouTube will show me any mercy. So please, consider hitting the like button below. It really helps me out a lot.
The South China Sea,
the hotly contested body of water.
China has conflicting territorial relations with
the 9-dash line.
The islands of the South China Sea delimits are China's inherent territory.
Chinese vessels are fanning out across
borders of these South China Sea countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia.
Japanese media has also reported that Chinese Coast Guard ships entered the country's territorial waters for a second day in a row.
So before we get into why China is willing to fight so many countries over the South China Sea, first, let's go over what makes this area so important. The South China Sea is a marginal sea in the Pacific Ocean, bounded by South China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Indonesia. This region is believed to have around 28 billion barrels of oil reserves, 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and holds 1/3 of the entire world's marine biodiversity, thereby making it a very important area for the ecosystem, even if fish stocks in the area are rapidly depleting. If all these weren't reason enough, the South China Sea is a very important trade route. As of 2019, around $3.37 trillion worth of global trade passes through this region annually. The main route to and from Pacific and Indian Ocean ports is through the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. Generally, oil and minerals move north, and food and manufactured goods move south. As I've covered in my previous videos, China is heavily dependent on oil imports to fuel its economy and its industries. Roughly 50% of Chinese oil imports come from the Middle East, and that oil sails through the South China Sea. And as you guys have already heard the last 1,000 times I've said it, China is the world's manufacturing hub, and its economic growth is fueled by selling those manufactured goods to the rest of the world. A big part of China's exports flow through the South China Sea into the rest of the world. So I'm sure you guys can see that the South China Sea is very important to China. But does that mean that it belongs to China? Yeah, I'm not quite sure. So let's look at China's supposed claim to this area in just a sec, but first let's go over the international law that defines who controls what part of the ocean. According to the Law of the Sea that was signed in a UN convention in 1982, each country's sovereign territorial waters extends to a maximum of 12 nautical miles, about 22 kilometers beyond its coast. But foreign vessels are granted the right of innocent passage through the zone. Beyond its territorial waters, every coastal country may establish an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, extending 200 nautical miles, about 370 kilometers from shore. Now, remember this, as this will become really important later on in the video. Within the EEZ, the coastal state has the right to exploit and regulate fisheries, construct artificial islands and installations, and use the zone for other economic purposes. Now, every country recognizes this law, including China, and this is actually how every country has claimed their part of the South China Sea. 200 nautical miles from their coast. Every country but China. There are some overlaps in Vietnamese, Malaysian, Brunei's, and Filipino claims, but no one is talking much about that because, well, all of these countries are united together against China's claim. You see, when it comes to this part of the sea, China doesn't want to follow the law of the sea. No. In fact, China wants to follow this made-up 9-dash line to exert its claim. This 9-dash line covers almost 90% of the South China Sea, and the CCP claims that it's all part of China. Now you may ask, what is the reasoning behind this 9-dash line, since there are no laws or really anything that mentions this? Well, according to the CCP's reasoning, a Chinese explorer discovered the South China Sea, so therefore, it belongs to China. I guess by that same reasoning, China belongs to Italy because Marco Polo, quote-unquote, discovered China. It's time for the CCP to pack it up and hand over the reins to the Italians. All right, jokes aside, that really is the reasoning the CCP has used to claim pretty much the whole South China Sea, and it has led to some very confrontational situations with other countries.
China.
Swarming and threatening
foreign military aircraft. I'm warning you again.
China's Communist Party is building on
previously unoccupied features
in the South China Sea.
More than 200 Chinese vessels
anchored at Whitsun Reef
for the disputed South China Sea.
These islands
indicates China's claims of sovereignty of fishing, navigation, and exploitation.
To assert their claim, several countries in the conflict officially renamed the region that they claimed. In September of 2012, the Philippine president signed an administrative order mandating that all government agencies use the name West Philippine Sea to refer to the parts of the South China Sea within the Philippines. Similarly, in 2017, Indonesia renamed northern reaches of its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea as the North Natuna Sea, in an attempt to assert its sovereignty. All while this is happening, the CCP starts building its own islands in the South China Sea. And not just any islands, military islands. They were home to a few military personnel, an airstrip, and a missile system. Based on international law, these islands were within the Philippines' border. So the Philippines decided to take China to UN court. In 2016, a ruling from The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines, claiming China had indeed encroached on their land, a ruling that the CCP chose to ignore and has not put into effect yet. To make matters worse, the CCP declared the airspace above the disputed land to be a defensive air identification zone, and issued a notice that aircrafts flying through it would need Chinese permission. This move, while they claim will only be enforced in defense, has further strained relations between these two countries. On top of this, there was a second part of this ruling that was just as important to the whole conflict. You guys remember earlier how I said that according to the law of the sea, 200 nautical miles from the coast is each country's exclusive economic zone? Well, so there's this group of islands in the middle of the South China Sea called the Spratly Islands that all the countries are trying to claim. The main reason being that if you establish a claim on the islands, you can extend your EEZ and control more of the South China Sea. But according to a 2016 ruling, the Spratly Islands were ruled a rock, so they don't extend any country's EEZ. This kind of killed the importance of the islands, but that doesn't mean that the conflict calmed down. China has been using something called the cabbage strategy, or the salami slicing strategy, to choke out supplies to foreign islands. To accomplish this, China will surround a foreign-controlled island with its ships and destroyers to deny access to rival nations, and then try to subsequently claim the islands. Now, of course, the United States has a lot of allies in this conflict, and we have the strongest navy in the world. One important part that the US Navy plays is maintaining peace at sea so world trade can continue without interruption. So, since China was being so aggressive in the South China Sea, the US Navy has increased its presence there to keep peace. And that's where this clip comes from.
US military aircraft, Papa 8 Alpha. This is Chinese Reef. of the natural islands, including your reef and its adjacent waters. Leave immediately and keep far off so as to avoid any misunderstanding.
Routine occurrence for us on these flights. It happens throughout the flight where they come over and then we just go back with our standard response, and it really has no effect on any operations or anything we do.
Now, that plane is from the US Navy, but here's a random fun fact for the video. The US Air Force has the most military aircrafts in the world. But right behind, in second place, is the US Navy, with the second most military aircrafts. Not really something you would expect. Back to the video. The US presence in the South China Sea is important because Beijing's claim in the South China Sea, especially to historic rights throughout the so-called Nine-Dash Line, threaten the centuries-old US commitment to freedom of the seas. That commitment helped underwrite American prosperity and security. Today, it stabilizes international commerce, mitigates naval tensions, and guarantees equitable access to resources. If China is able to undermine the UN's law of the sea, what's to say that it will follow other laws? And what's to say that other countries won't do the same if China is able to claim territory while breaking the law? This is why US-China tensions are also rising with the CCP's actions in the South China Sea. And even though things were more calm during COVID, China's actions are again picking up steam in the South China Sea, and this time, China is breaking their own promises. Let me explain. In 2011, China, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam agreed on a set of preliminary guidelines on the implementation of the Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, which would help resolve disputes. Following the spirit of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, China and ASEAN countries actively advanced the consultations on the Code of Conduct, or COC, in the South China Sea, with the forecast that the COC will be completed by 2021. As you can already tell, the timeline for resolution, it's not really panned out. But that COC has helped maintain some peace in the South China Sea. One important rule in this COC was that no country is allowed to build on unoccupied reefs. But according to a recent Bloomberg report that came out last December, it seems like China has decided to stop following the COC. Fishing fleets that operate as de facto maritime militias under the control of authorities in Beijing have carried out construction activities at 4 unoccupied features. A report said new land formations have appeared above water over the past year at El Dad Reef in the northern Spratlys, with images showing large holes, debris piles, and excavator tracks at a site that used to only be partially exposed at high tide. This kind of action could mean a lot of things on what the CCP is planning for the future, and none of those possibilities are good for world peace. China's actions have prompted other nations in the region to step up their defense spending. Now, I don't want to speculate on what the CCP is planning, but if there's any concrete news on this topic, I will be making another video. So be sure to hit that subscribe button.